Hey there, it's Simon Hurley from Inklips and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be sharing how to emboss on your cards and lots of the basics of embossing. And I'll also share some tips, tricks, and different tools that I find to be really helpful to get a great embossed image every time and to fix a couple of the things that you may be having problems with. Embossing powder is so much fun. It's like that card making magic trick that you get shown and you just fall in love with card making. And also there are so many different things you can do with embossing powder and techniques and things like that that are really awesome. So I'll be sharing more videos throughout this week of different embossing powder techniques and different card making projects so you guys can get more inspired using embossing powder. And also Tonic Studios was kind enough to provide me with a 10% off discount for all of you guys. So use the shopping link down below in the description bar and use the code SIMON for 10% off of your order. And the best part is it's not just embossing powders. You can stock up on anything Tonic or Nuvo related, which is really great. So you can do your shopping with embossing powders and then buy some other things that you've always wanted as well. And I'm not sure when that's going to end either. I think it might be a week or two, so be sure to stock up now so you don't miss that fun deal. So I'm going to share lots of different tools and then I'll move on into the tips and techniques that I think are really helpful for card making. So let's get started and turn on to the work surface. So one thing that I really recommend investing in is a good quality heat tool. I had one that was a lot cheaper and it broke down after a little while, so I had to purchase a new one. So I would recommend just biting the bullet and investing in a tool that's really good quality at the beginning. So I have this WAGNER heat tool. I believe it's the similar one to the Milwaukee heat tool that Holtz used to make. It's got this end here, this nozzle, which has a really great concentrated heat, so it heats up your projects really quickly, and I find there's less warping using it. So I've always had great quality results with this. You just want to make sure that after you're done using it, you don't touch this end. This part gets really hot of it because it's that metal, so you just want to make sure you keep it on its stand and avoid touching it once it's done. But I've had nothing but great results from this. Another thing you're going to want to have is a clear sticky ink, and this will hold your embossing powder to the surface of the cardstock until it's heat set and bonded there. So I either like VersaMark or the Nuvo Clear Mark ink pad, and I've switched over to this one because I find that it's a lot juicier, and my VersaMark ink pad has been well loved. So I switched over to the Clear Mark ink pad, and I've had great results with this one as well. It's just that nice clear sticky ink pad. Another thing that I really find super helpful is an embossing bag. So I have this one, but you can also buy it in kind of a tool form too, where it releases that powder and gets rid of all the static on the surface and any fingerprints you might have. So it really keeps your embossing really nice and clean, and it's a little bit messy, so I keep it inside this little dish here when it's in storage. And also for cleanup, I find coffee filters to be really helpful to funnel it all back into those tiny little jars. And I also find that Swiffer dusting cloths picks up any of the glitter embossing powders really well, or any color or powder that you don't want on the surface. And one thing that's optional, but I really recommend because it saves me a lot of time, is getting some nice Tupperware containers to hold your white or clear embossing powder or anything that you use a ton. That way you're not always funneling it back into the jar, and these fit an A2 size card in them. So I'll link down below the ones that I use, but this really has saved me tons of time to just be able to scoop my embossing powder over and then shove back on the lid and kind of forget about it. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to do some basic embossing. I'm going to use the Hipster stamp set from Tim because I feel like there's lots of great images in here that have lots of different details, so I can really show how all that detail is transferred with the embossing powder. So to get started with the embossing, you're going to want to prep your surface. So I'm just going to take this little powder bag here and just kind of pat it down a couple times, which gets some of that powder out there, and then just kind of rub it over the surface. And this makes sure that there's no static on the surface anymore, and any fingerprints or anything are gone. So this really helps to get rid of any of the static, and none of the powder will cling where you don't want it to then. Then I'm going to bring in my Clear Mark ink pad, and I'm just going to ink up this little image here. You're going to want to give it nice and lots of ink to make sure it's all covered. And it'll be kind of hard to see on camera, but in real life, you'll know that it's covered when it's got that nice sheen over top of all of it. So then I can put it over on top of the cardstock and stamp it down nicely. And then it's really hard to see on camera and kind of hard to see in real life. If I tip the paper here, I can see a little bit of that image here, but then where the real magic comes in is with the embossing powder. Okay, so I'm using the Copper Blush Embossing Powder, which is a new color from Nuvo, and I'll use a coffee filter to kind of contain the mess, but you can also use a piece of folded cardstock. So I'll take this color here, and you just want to sprinkle it over top of the whole image. And don't be worried about using too much embossing powder, because most of it will end up going back in the jar. So you just want to make sure your image is really nicely covered here. And then I just give it a nice couple taps to get rid of any of the excess powder there that might be left behind. Before I get to heat setting, all this excess powder needs to go back into the little jar here. So I just fold it up in the coffee filter here, and there's these little openings on the bottom, and that just allows me to really easily and quickly pour it back into the jar with no mess, and then you didn't waste anything, and these last a long time because you hardly use any of it for each image. So now here's me heating up the image. I put my heat tool off to the side for a little bit and let it warm up a little while, and that way it doesn't warp my paper as much as it's kind of heating up, and it's less time of heat onto the actual cardstock. So I didn't want to really fast forward this one as much because I wanted to show you kind of real time how it all happens. So then once the embossing powder starts changing color, I move my heat tool around to the next area, and you can see that I'm not really keeping my heat tool in one place because I don't want to burn anything here. So once it's all nice and shiny, then I call it a day and stop heating. So here's the finished embossed image. That copper blush color is like a really nice rose gold, and once it's all embossed, it gives you this kind of cool texture on here, and it's a little bit raised from the surface too. Okay, so now I'm going to stamp my sentiment here, and I'm using an image from that same set, grabbing my clear mark ink pad, and I'm going to stamp down the sentiment on the little strip here. But I do this a lot, where you might have noticed I forgot to apply the anti-static powder tool. So sometimes it can make the powder go where you don't want it to, and I'll share how to quickly kind of fix that here. So I'll just take some of this white powder and apply it over the top of that sentiment. And you can see here, something like this might happen if you don't use your powder bag. My finger could have been there, or there's different oils on the cardstock or something. So I'm bringing in this really tiny little Nuvo brush here, and it's really helpful when it's super small like this. That way I can go in and just get rid of some of that powder. And by brushing it off, it just removes it from the surface of that cardstock. So you can really get rid of any mistakes that you made. It might take a little bit of extra time, but if you forgot to use that powder tool, this can be a lifesaver if you don't want to emboss it again and retry. Now because this is such a small strip of cardstock, I don't really want to hold it right here because my heat tool is going to come in. So I really like these EK Success tweezers, and I just pinch them and they clasp down onto the cardstock so you can hold it a little bit farther away when you're heating it up. So you're not going to burn your hand when you're heating this. So you want to heat it until it's really nice and shiny. You don't want to continue to heat it after that because it could burn and kind of make a weird look on your cardstock. So right when it turns shiny, I would definitely stop heating it, and then you'll be good to go. So now I just want to show one thing that you don't want to do, you want to avoid doing when you're embossing, because it can give you really bad looks and it'll kind of ruin your project. So I'm going to go in here and do the same thing that I've been doing. I'll ink up my image with that clear mark ink pad, and make sure our surface is colored with that embossing buddy there to make sure any static is gone. I'll stamp my image down onto the surface there, and then I'm going to go in and emboss it. So I'll just apply that right onto the surface there, and I'll heat set this again, but I'm going to show you one thing that you don't want to do. So when I'm bringing in my heat tool, like I said earlier, I just heat it until it gets nice and shiny, and then you want to stop after that. But here's what happens if you overheat your embossing powder. So I went a little bit overboard to the point where I actually burned my cardstock. But if you heat it so much, the embossing powder just kind of sinks into that cardstock. It gets rid of all that shine that it has, and it just kind of dulls it all down. So you can see those edges still have a tiny little bit of shine, but that inside is completely dull and it's got some burnt edges. So you just want to make sure that you stop right once it turns nice and shiny, and then you'll have a great embossed image where if you heat it too much, it can do a little something like this. So I'm going to share a really helpful tip when using solid stamps. So I'm going to use this solid image from the Sakura Blossom Altenew set here. So I'm going to share the next technique on black cardstock as well, because I feel like it'll really show any imperfections in it because it's got that really nice contrast to the embossing powder. So I'll bring in the little anti-static embossing bag, pat it on the surface a couple times, and then make sure that it's rubbed alongside the cardstock to get rid of any static or anything like that. And you'll notice it kind of tints the cardstock with that powder there, and I'll show how to easily remove that later. So then I'm going to go in with my clear mark ink pad here, and I'll ink up this image. And I'm going to bring in a little piece of fun foam here, just to put underneath my stamping since I'm doing a really solid image. And then I'll stamp this down, giving it really nice pressure. So once that's all stamped down, I can then apply my embossing powder here. I'm using that same coffee filter again, and this time I'm using the soft lilac embossing powder from Nuvo. So I'll sprinkle on any embossing powder, and don't be worried about using too much. Again, you just want really nice coverage here. So sometimes if you heat an image straight from the front like this, it can blow some of that powder off because this is such concentrated heat and it's blowing really fast at it. So sometimes I like to go on the back of the cardstock here, and I'll do it to show you guys here, but it really heats this up and gives a really nice smooth effect because it doesn't remove any of the embossing powder. So I don't do that with everything here, but you can see that when it's finished, it looks super solid and there's no little gaps in there. So sometimes if you're struggling to get a really nice solid image there, heating it from the back can be really helpful to get great results every time. So now since this is still really visible, this powder is really tinting that cardstock there, it should be a lot darker. I'm going to bring in a Swiffer cloth here. So this is one of those large Swiffer dusting cloths, and I cut mine down into little pieces. That way I can use them a little bit more and get more use out of them. So I'm going to take this Swiffer cloth and just rub it over the top of that surface. And this really gets rid of any of that excess powder on there. It picks up that little baby powder that's still on there and removes it to reveal that nice black cardstock again. So just having a little Swiffer cloth around can be really helpful to pick up any powder. So I just wanted to share this really quickly. When it comes to embossing powder, these are just little tiny granules of plastic that when they're heated up, they melt onto the surface of the cardstock, and that's what creates that fun kind of plasticky kind of resisted feeling. So you need something to bond this to the surface of the cardstock or hold it there until it heats up and holds itself there. So I'll show some other alternatives to the VersaMark ink in case if you don't have that or aren't looking to purchase one. There are a couple other things that you can use that give some similar and really cool results. So here are some other fun alternatives to just using that clear mark ink pad. You can also bring in a Distress Oxide ink because these are pigment based and they have a little bit more drying time. Ranger and Tim made them that way so you can have that little extra time for blending, but it also works really nicely for heat embossing too. So I'll ink up that image there. Then I can stamp it right down on my surface. So I'm just going to apply the powder right over top of there. And you can see that it sticks really well, but you want to make sure you heat set this right away. You don't want to wait any time, because if this dries and you try to heat set it, the powder will just fly off because it doesn't have anything to stick to. So another alternative to get a similar result with that clear powder looking like it's colored and getting kind of a similar result there, I'm going to bring in my clear mark ink pad here. I'll ink the surface of that stamp up, and then I'll go in with some hybrid ink here. It can be hybrid ink, dye ink, whatever you guys have. It'll all work here. So I'm just going to go in Make sure it's nice and inked up. And that provides that sticky layer first. So you have that nice sticky layer of that embossing ink on there with that hybrid ink right on top. You can also do the same thing in your stamping tool. If you're worried about contaminating your ink pads, you can bring in your stamp platform and do those inks in separate layers then. So I've applied over that embossing powder. You can see how nicely that sticks on there. And then I'll go in and heat set it right away. So you can see there that that's a really good way to get the look of different colors of embossing powder if you don't have a ton of colors on hand. It's similar, but it doesn't give that same result that you have, and it also doesn't work on black cardstock, so you have to keep that in mind. One more fun application of the powder is using the clear mark pen. So this is another easy way to apply it onto the surface. So I'm just going to grab my anti-static powder tool, rub it over the surface here, and then I can get right on into it. So I'll just quickly write a little word here. I'm going to write hello. Now I can see my writing in real life. It might be a little difficult to see on camera there. I don't see it perfectly, but I can get a little bit of a view here so that I know where I'm writing. And when you tilt it in the light, you can really see that image there. And I think you guys can see that on the camera too. So I'm going to bring in this fun golden kind of color with that glitter inside of it. And I'll bring in my coffee filter again. Then I'll just dump it over the surface of that, tap off the excess, and there you go. You have that really fun sentiment there. So I'm just going to heat up my image. Don't worry about the glitters there. It doesn't really matter, and I'll show you what to do with them after. So these powders are a little bit more difficult to use because they have glitter in them too. So they give you that fun and glittery shine, but they leave a lot of glitter behind too. So bringing in one of these Swiffer cloths again, I just dust over the surface and it'll remove most all the glitter there that was in your cardstock. And also on the surface of my desk too, you can run in with that Swiffer cloth, or if you have that surface sweep again, you can really quickly just dust that off the surface of your desk and make sure that it's off your project too. So you can use either one of those and they both work really nicely. So when I have my embossing powders stored in a drawer, I keep them upright like this, but they didn't come with these colors on the top. And I find that it's kind of hard to tell exactly what the color is going to look like just from looking in that bottle there. So I'll share quickly how I labeled these. It's super easy and simple. That way you get an idea of what the color will look like once it hits your cardstock. So there's this new copper blush color from Nuvo that I haven't labeled yet. So I'm just going to open it up here, and this gem lid is a little bit difficult. So instead of putting a piece of cardstock with the color on it or anything like that, I take my clear mark ink pad and I just kind of press it right down into the surface there. I don't really roll it around, I just want the color right in the center of that little gem. So then I'll take my coffee filter and I'll take my copper blush embossing powder and just dump it onto the surface there. And kind of looks like not much on there, on that little plastic piece. It doesn't look like a ton. But then when I start heating it up, it really turns into that color and gives it great labeling. So there you go, you can get a really good idea of what the color looks like that. I keep my heat tool moving around on here just so it doesn't burn, because I don't know how heat stable this little lid is, but then I'm able to just dump the powder right back inside of the jar there and put my lid right back on, and then I know exactly what the color will be just by having the little container stood up like this. And I did the same thing on other lids here. This is Ranger's embossing powder, and these lids are a little bit thinner, but I was still able to dip them in the ink there and then quickly throw a layer of that embossing powder right over top. And I just, again, kept my heat tool moving pretty fast so I wouldn't burn or warp that plastic lid, but it really helps to have this color on top. Alright, so I hope you guys really enjoyed that video and learned a little bit more about fun embossing powders and how to improve the image. Be sure to give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and click that subscribe button down below if you want to see more videos like this one. And don't forget to use that shopping link down below and the code Simon for 10% off of your order at Tonic Studios. I'll see you guys very soon in another card making and crafting video. Bye!